You're in charge of your own body. It's true.
Bracken's fault. My life sucks. Bracken's
Wake
fault.
up in the middle of the night,
Bracken's fault.
can't sleep.
Bracken's
Lo
fault.
juro lealtad a la bandera de los Estados Unidos de América y una república que representa.
It is
Yeah,
getting
that's
better.
it. That's all they have.
Guevara, can you hear me?
She's still connected to audio.
Can you hear me, Guevara?
Yes, I can.
Great.
That's why you're sleeping.
I wasn't sleeping. Oh. Were you just like, you just make jokes like, fall asleep. I was like, I don't even fall asleep. No, that's the thing about him. He said a joke. He said it like 5 years. No, but it is true. And I did talk to him about it. He's like, I don't think oh yeah, that's what I think about him. I really, he legitimately. So much. So you're like, I don't know. You sure you're not? I don't think so. I don't think so. Show up whenever you want. Well, then 5 minutes later. It starts with. Number two, we need the tea.
Before we get started, I think it's appropriate to remind you that a week from today, we will have exam number 3. Exam number 3 will be over chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. 11, 12, 13, and 14. We are skipping chapter 15, the immune system, because we don't have time, and that's covered in other courses. That means the final will be over 16, 17, 18, hopefully 19 and 20. That's, yeah, that is a lot. And if we skip a chapter, we will probably skip 19. Is that a question, Luke, or is that you just? Oh, okay. I thought that was you ready to slap Bracken or something, or maybe, okay. You're close. Luke, should I be concerned? Do I need to call Mrs. Dashner and set up an appointment for you? Yes, Carrie, I have a student prone to self-harm. He plays soccer and he keeps hitting himself. No, I don't think we'll go there. Okay, Kavara, tell me if the slides move.
They're not moving, but I have them in front of me. So
And I'm not getting them moving either. So, oh boy, they're not moving. Okay, what's
you
going
can't
on
get
here?
them to move though. It's fine because I have them pulled up in front of me. There they go.
Okay,
They're
let me, let's try this again. They're moving?
No.
No? Well, I'll probably just do this then. All right, we are going to talk about the digestive system today. The lab this week is over the digestive system. We have a student who is very faithfully representing our school on the golf course. And if any of you have been checking your Facebook feed, you probably noticed that our very own Caitlin Leischer was almost in the top 10 with the last golf match they were in. So congratulations, Caitlin. So are you best on the greens or in the fairway or a little both or a little both? Depends on the day. Okay. My very short stint on golfing, I was always much better on the greens than I ever was on the fairway. It was an absolute disaster on the fairway. I was not quite a complete idiot on the greens. As we're on the fairway, forget it. So since I started golfing, I went from bad to worse. I said I should probably quit while I'm ahead. So
Start caring too much.
yeah, I probably started caring too much. So, and I didn't have the talent for it like Caitlin obviously has. So she'll be gone again. So we wish her well. And we hope you shoot even better in this round too. Very good. So the digestive system. So digestion very simply means you're taking large macromolecules and you're breaking them down into smaller macromolecules that is then absorbed and integrated into your body or broken down for ATP, which is then used for bodily processes, whatever those processes may be. That essentially is what's meant by digestion. So digestion includes motility. So let's say, for example, let's say Nana over here goes into the DC for breakfast, and let's say he gets, I don't know, a bagel. You never go there. Okay, let's say at his house, he gets a bagel from Panera, and so it's a good bagel. And he, watch, you look at me just to say, I don't even never eat at Panera either. And he gets a bagel and he cuts it in half and he toasts it and throws some, I don't know, peanut butter? Peanut butter, okay, that'll work, peanut butter on it. And peanut butter and maybe some jam, maybe some honey, maybe something else like that to help with that. And then he woofs it down for his breakfast before he comes to class. So the food goes into his oral cavity, but ultimately, after it undergoes digestion, it will come out the anus as fecal material. That takes a lot of motility. So motility is one of the main functions of the GI tract. So there's a lot of smooth muscle lining the GI tract. Only a small fraction of that muscle is voluntary. Most of it is involuntary and is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Swallowing or deglutition is part of the voluntary part of that motion. Peristalsis, that's going to move food through the GI tract, is going to be the main way food is going to get through the GI tract. Mastication or chewing the food takes large clumps of food, breaks it into smaller clumps of food that can be more easily digested. And then ingestion simply means taking the food into the mouth. So when Nana takes his bagel and clamps down on it with his choppers, essentially, that's the ingestion part of the equation. Secretion involves the release of, first of all, regulatory molecules. These are endocrine molecules. There'll be lots of them. Most of them are peptides. And then digestion itself, the actual breakdown of the larger macromolecules, polysaccharides, fats, proteins into fatty acids and glycerol in the case of fats, into monomer sugars, monosaccharides in the case of polysaccharides, and amino acids in the case of proteins. Then those get absorbed. So you pass them through the enterocytes of the mucosal cells and then ultimately into the bloodstream or the lymphatics in the case of fats, as we will see. So motility, secretion, digestion, absorption, all of those are functions of the gastrointestinal tract. The gastrointestinal tract has a structure that is pretty recognizable no matter where you are in the GI tract. There are 4 layers. Those 4 layers are called tunics. And going from the innermost to the outermost, you have the mucosa. That's the part that will interact with food bolus. Beneath that, you have the submucosa. Your nerves, and then a lot of your glands and things like that, blood vessels are on the submucosa. Then the muscularis. That's going to house the smooth muscle. And then finally, the serosa. The serosa is an outer layer, and it consists of connective tissue. This will also interact with other types of membranes and things like that. The body wall, depending on where you are in the GI tract and things like that. And the serosa is an important part also of the structure of the GI tract as well. So this is a picture shamelessly stolen from your book, and it shows you the 4 different layers of the GI tract. So the mucosa, as you can see, is folded into various layers. Those layers form kind of a set of circular, kind of valve-like looking indentations, and they're circular. So plica refers to a little fold. So they're circular, so they're called plica circularis. That's essentially how the mucosa is folded. This folding increases the surface area for absorption. Beneath the mucosa, you have the submucosa. And then you have 2 sets of smooth muscle. The innermost one is circular, that surrounds the tube. And then there's a longitudinal muscle. Now the stomach is going to have an extra layer as well called the oblique layer. That's not what you have in the rest of the GI tract. So the stomach is weird in that regard. But these 2 are going to work together to help move food through the GI tract. The outer serosal layers, you can see it, will sometimes interact with maybe mesenteric membranes, in the case of the small intestine. And in other cases, they may actually be embedded in the body wall. In fact, in that case, it won't be called serosa, they'll be called adventitia, but that's another story. So if we take these and kind of blow it up, we can see something in a bit more detail. So your mucosa essentially consists of a layer of columnar epithelial cells, and particularly in the small intestine, these areas of the mucosa are folded into these little finger-like extensions. Those little finger-like extensions form the so-called villi. These villi contain a blood system. That blood system is in the submucosa. The blood system will come into this finger-like projection. There's also single projection of the lymphatic system. This is known as a lacteal. You also have these deep indentations in their glands in the submucosa. They will be secreting things into the GI tract. And you have something called an intestinal crypt. Intestinal crypt, if you use markers of cell division, you can do this with bromidioxyuridine. They're very good antibodies for bromidioxyuridine. It'll get incorporated wherever cells are dividing. And if you incubate these cells with bromidioxyuridine, and then you take them and fix them and put the antibody for bromidioxyuridine on there, the bromidioxyuridine all goes to the crypt. This is your mitotically active place in the GI tract. These cells divide, they come out this way, and they get sloughed off this way. So these cells essentially are going to come up here, they'll mature, they'll get sloughed off like that. The GI tract is extremely mitotically active. The GI tract is always replacing itself. This is one reason why this is one of the areas that's susceptible to cancer, and also why this is one of the areas that gets hit the hardest when you have chemotherapy, because of the tendency to destroy dividing cells, and you have a tissue that needs to be renewed on a regular basis. Notice that there is a small layer of smooth muscle. This is more structural. and that is going to divide the mucosa from submucosa, and this is called the muscularis mucosae. The muscularis mucosae is pretty easy to see. When you see that, that tells you that's a dividing line between the mucosa and the submucosa. Notice in the submucosa, you have your blood vessels, you have your glands, you have things like that. Also in the mucosa, you may have lymph nodules. There are a lot of these throughout the GI tract. They are going to be surveilling things in the GI tract, and if there's a native nasty essentially in the GI tract, they will alert the immune system to it. They also play a role in food allergies as well. Incidentally, have you gone through the drugstore or Meijer or Walmart? I actually saw some at Kroger the other day for these little blood tests to see if you have food allergies. Have you seen those little kits on shelves? Don't buy them, they're a scam. They don't work. I know the lady who designed the company was on Shark Tank. I know she got the people on Shark Tank to give her lots and lots of money to develop this business. Every allergist will tell you those tests are bull, add the epithet, essentially. That's how useful they are. Just because you have antibodies circulating in your blood that may react to food antigens means nothing. Everybody has antibodies that react to some food allergens. Do you show symptoms? So you need to do this with an in-house challenge test in an allergist's office. Don't buy those tests, they are a scam. Someone comes in and says, I have food allergies because I took these tests on these this box that I got from Walmart or something like that. Smile at them and say, oh, hon, you should have saved your money. That test is useless, absolutely useless. I'm sorry, but you were scammed.
Yeah, because you either have to do the challenge test or you can do genetic testing for that too as well, right?
Genetic testing is not developed to the point yet where you can usually do it. It's, you take essentially some food, you give it to the child or the adult or whatever, you look for symptoms. That's done in an office, the doctor knows what to look for, and if you show symptoms with a food challenge, then you have a food allergy. It's through a medical history. It's not, the blood tests are used to confirm what you get with a medical history. Every allergist will tell you so the medical history first. Then you go to the blood tests, and then you do atopy tests, things like that. You go to the blood tests first, they mean nothing. They must be interpreted in light of medical history. Then getting off track again, and pull myself back here. So this infolding is going to increase the surface area, increase the opportunities for absorption as well. Once again, you can see the circular muscle is the inner layer, the longitudinal muscle is the outer layer, and then the serosa. The serosa is largely connective tissue. Very important connective tissue, though, because it will provide the reinforcement for the walls of the GI tract. So the mucosal cells, the enterocyte cells, they are a good solid epithelium. They lie on a proper basement membrane, the lamina propria. You have specialized cells in the mucosa that will secrete mucus to lubricate things. Those are goblet cells. You find those really throughout the GI tract. You find them in the mucosa as well. Here is an example of some of these enterocytes. You can see them here. And then they kind of look like a goblet. And these are the cells that secrete mucus. Notice that they're pretty easy to see. With an H&E stain, they look dark purple because the mucus contains acidic carbohydrates. So they stain with this nice purple color. And here are your central vascular elements here. Here's your basement membrane. You can see it pretty plainly here. And you can see the goblet cells, they're pretty easy to see. They make the mucus that lubricates things. Yeah, that's a blown up villus with a section and an H&E stain, and then embedded in paraffin and mounted. And it's quite pretty, as you can see. Here's an even closer look at that goblet cell. You look at that cell and it's, you know, the old Sesame Street song, one of these is not like the other, comes to mind, doesn't it? It's different than everything else. It kind of, in fact, jumps out at you, especially with an H&E stain, which is the main standard stain for tissue biopsies of this sort. So the muscularis mucosae is going to help maintain those those plica folds into which the mucosa is folded. And this will be the border between the mucosa and the submucosa. Again, this is not contractile, it's more structural to maintain the plicae. You can see the muscularis mucosae here in this very beautiful Alcian red stain. And you can see it right there. And so that is submucosa, that is mucosa. That's your, as they say in Spanish, frontera. That's your border between the two. And beneath the mucosa, you have the submucosa. This is very vascularized. You see the source of the blood vessels, they're going to be in the submucosa. So the materials absorbed by the mucosal cells pass into the vascular elements that have their origin in the submucosa. Submucosa also contains glands, it contains nerve plexi. You can see some of these here with the, so see all the red doodads there? Those are all blood vessels. You're sectioning across them like that. So here's your villi here. There's your muscularis mucosae, submucosae, lots and lots of blood vessels there. And there's your muscles there. And you can just really see the vascularized nature of the submucosa very well. So then the muscularis externa, that's your layer of smooth muscle below the lamina propria for the submucosa. That will be responsible for both the segmental and the peristaltic movements of food through the GI, and these will coordinate in their contractions to move through the GI tract. The motions don't just move the food bolus, they also pulverize it, break it into smaller bits as well. Here's an up close and personal look at the two layers of the muscle. And you can see there's the longitudinal, there's the circular, and there's your submucosa up there. Usually in slides, the demarcation between these is quite clear, largely because when you fix it, the submucosa will tend to contract. And so you usually get a space between the mucosa and the muscles. You can see that right there. The tissue in its living color, the submucosa is usually right against it, but when you fix it, usually the submucosa will contract. You have nerve plexi within these muscles, and that's nerve plexi will help tell these muscles when to relax, when to constrict, and they're called the, there are a couple of them. They are either the myenteric plexus, the myenteric plexus, also known as the Auerbach plexus, after the very famous histologist, Gerhard Auerbach, who also did a lot of very important work on the pathology of cigarette smoke. He was one of the people who discovered that cigarette smoking actually leads to cancer. So this one, as you can see, lies between the two layers of muscle. This is just a close-up of the Auerbach plexus. You have nerve type cells that will have divisions of both arms of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then at the base of the longitudinal muscle will be the so-called Meissner plexus, otherwise known as the submucosal plexus. And that will also provide autonomic nerve supply to the muscles as well. And then the outer tunic, that's your serosa, and that's protective layer, you have connective tissue. And on the very outside, it is covered with a layer of squamous epithelium. So one of the main innervators of the GI tract is the vagus nerve. That shouldn't be a huge surprise, seeing that it's the longest of the cranial nerves and one of the major parasympathetic branches. And seeing that the GI tract, its activation requires the activity of the parasympathetic nerve. So it will innervate the esophagus and the stomach and the pancreas and the bladder, the small intestine, and the upper portion of the small intestine. The lower bit of the small intestine will actually come from the sacral region. So these long parasympathetic fibers, the preganglionic fibers, then will synapse with preganglionic neurons in the myenteric and the submucosal plexi. And then in keeping with this theme, resolve with the autonomic nervous system. The preganglionic fibers are quite long, the postganglionic fibers are quite short. Same song, second verse here. Sympathetic nerve contribution will reduce peristaltic and secretory activity. They will instead stimulate contraction of the sphincters. So they will essentially keep food in certain places. And this is one of the reasons why stress can cause kind of an upset stomach. The old bromide is, the person hasn't flown very much, they get on the plane, they start to get a so-called nervous stomach, and they feel a little bit sick. That stress causes activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Their stomach will not empty, and as the food sits in the stomach, it will start to upset the stomach a little bit. That's essentially the sympathetic nervous system keeping that pyloric sphincter in the stomach shut. These sympathetic nerves also pass through the myenteric and submucosal ganglia, but again, in keeping with the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system, you will tend to have shorter postganglionic axons and shorter preganglionic axons and longer postganglionic axons. So the axons that make it there usually come from ganglia that are a right bit farther away. Yes.
Is the frontal reflex
The vagus nerve sends its axon straight into the myenteric and the submucosal plexi. So the nerves then, they synapse there and then they go to other plexi. And those targets usually are quite short, or they go to terminal ganglia that are right next to the GI tract, and then they will send their axon. So it depends where in the GI tract you are. Terminal ganglia, again, they're very close to their target, just like what you have in the eye and what have you. So again, the postganglionic axons are short in the case of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so next we now take a look at the stomach, the esophagus, and so on and so forth. So going back to Nana and his breakfast bagel. So he chews the bagel and it gets broken up into small fragments. The fragments get rolled around on the tongue, it gets tasted. And Nana says, blueberry bagel. Like blueberry bagels. Good, I'm not doing mythology here. And he goes, peanut butter. And so the tongue, which is a huge muscle that lines the roof of the floor of the mouth, the roof of the mouth is going to separate it from the nasal cavity. And it is anterior to the so-called hard palate. That provides a hard surface for the tongue to mash the food against. And then posterior to that, you have the soft palate. And that moves together along with a pendulum-like structure called the uvula that points down. That's kind of a valve that makes sure food flows down instead of going up into the nasal cavity. Then he has 3 sets of salivary glands. So the sublingual salivary glands, which are right below the tongue. And sometimes the dentist, when you go to the dentist will take their gloved hand and feel underneath your tongue. She's trying to feel those sublingual salivary glands to make sure there aren't any hard spots. And then the submandibular ones, which are below the mandible. And then the parotid glands, which are near the ear. They will all secrete saliva. The saliva will have a little bit of mucus, and then it will have juices that contain enzymes. So the main enzyme is so-called salivary amylase. Salivary amylase is going to take long carbohydrates and it'll break them down into simpler sugars. This is the beta amylase, so it takes carbohydrate polysaccharides and it clips them at the ends. Our body, we don't make alpha amylases, bacteria make alpha amylases. Alpha amylases clip internally. We chew them from the end. So you're going to clip it off 2 at a time. And you're going to make maltose, which is glucose. That's maltose. It's a little more complicated than that, but just trust me on that one. It's maltose. Yeah. Maltose has a sweeter taste than does starch. So you could actually do a little experiment that goes like this. You could actually take a cracker and you can chew the cracker, and the longer you chew it, the sweeter it gets. That's salivary amylase doing its job. Now, it won't get sweet because it's maltose. Maltose is not as sweet as sugar, but when you first put the cracker in your mouth, it tastes basically like a salted piece of cardboard. And then as you chew it, now it becomes, this is actually kind of good tasting. That's the work of salivary amylase. Then that bolus of food gets swallowed through the pharynx and it goes into the esophagus. Right at that moment, there's a little spoon-shaped flap of cartilage called the epiglottis that goes down as you swallow and acts like a lid, seals off the airway so you don't aspirate any food by accident. Now, I want you to take these fingers and put them on either side of the throat here. Don't choke yourself and just swallow and tell me like that. How'd you feel? Yeah. So the first set of muscles, as they contract, it causes these two to relax. And then the second one set that they contract, it causes the bottom one to relax. Then the bottom one contracts, and the upper 3 relax, just in case you didn't swallow everything all the way, because if it contracted all the way, it just will choke the heck out of it. So it's a coordinated sort of thing. And when you get a physical, which is mine, the doctor will always go here and say swallow, just to make sure, because if you have any sort of neurological issue, that's usually one of the first things to go, is your swallowing mechanism. And if you swallow properly, the doctor is trying to feel for the beep, 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 sort of kind of stoplight sort of, I call it stoplight sort of contraction and relaxation as you swallow. So now we go to the epiglottis, and the first part of the epiglottis, the upper part, has voluntary muscle in it. That'll help you swallow. The lower part of the esophagus is all involuntary. Now it is going to undergo an involuntary form of peristalsis. Wherever the food bolus is, it deforms the esophagus, and that causes it to relax. Everything below it is also caused to relax. Everything above it is caused to contract. That's why you can do an experiment with kids. You can have a kid drink the water, then you pick them up and hold them by their ankles and say swallow. And if they swallow the water, they'll go down unless you make them laugh. Make them laugh and it comes up their nose. But that is an experiment you can do with little kids to show them essentially how this peristalsis will actually defy gravity. And it works best with little kids because they're easier to hold essentially by the ankles. You do it with high school kids, you just have to say, okay, swing your legs up, I'll just grab and hold you. And make sure you don't get kicked in the face if that happens, because some of these kids don't respect their elders. And you just drop them. Right, then you just drop them on their head and then you get your revenge. And you will never be invited back to that school again as long as you live. So this is coordination essentially of that muscular layer below the submucosa. And again, this coordination is due to a very complex set of nerve arrangements that make sure that wherever you are deformed, that relaxes and everything below it relaxes and everything above it contracts. If the esophagus does not undergo peristalsis properly, you have a condition called achalasia. And people with achalasia essentially have to depend on gravity, and they have to eat very small bites, and treatment with achalasia is usually involves just trying to get the esophagus to relax. So Botox injections actually into the esophagus can help with that. The esophagus actually will pass through a hole in the diaphragm. That's called the esophageal hiatus. If the stomach herniates through that, you have a so-called hiatal hernia, because that opening is supposed to be nice and tight. That hiatal hernia can hurt, especially when you're playing soccer or something like that. The bolus of food at this point is called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. Chyme refers to an undigested bolus of food in the GI tract. There's a thickening as the esophagus meets with the stomach. That is called the lower esophageal sphincter. That lower esophageal sphincter, in response to pressure, will open. The food will then go into the stomach, and then in response to the relief of that pressure, it will close. In some people, it doesn't close all the way, and you get acid backwashing into the esophagus. That's called gastric esophageal reflux disease, or GERD, which is colloquially known as acid reflux. The esophagus is not built to handle acid like the stomach is. So the esophagus will get eroded as a result of that. It will divide to try and replace the eroded areas. Eventually, the cells, instead of being kind of columnar, will start to flatten. That's a metaplastic change. And if they keep dividing uncontrollably, we can get a condition called Barrett's esophagus. That's a precancerous condition. Esophageal cancer is very aggressive. That's why if you have Barrett's esophagus, you have to get that surgically dealt with ASAP. And if you have GERD, you need to take proton pump inhibitors to make sure your esophagus heals and stays healed. There is a surgical procedure called Nielsen fundoreduplication that can fix that sphincter, and then you won't have to be on the pills anymore, but it's surgery. All right, what happens in the stomach? The stomach contains stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, and lots of it. It also mixes it with an enzyme called pepsin, which we will work with tomorrow, for those of you who are in lab tomorrow. Pepsin is going to degrade mainly protein. You don't degrade really much else in the stomach. The stomach, however, because of its muscular contractions, is going to mix the food extensively with the pepsin and the acid. The acid is going to denature molecules so that they're exposed, so that they're much more easily degraded by the cadre of enzymes that this food will experience in the small intestine. So the stomach kind of is shaped like a letter J. It is very distendable, very stretchy. You have strong acid and proteolytic enzymes that will tend to kill microbes in the stomach, and then the food gets transformed from the bolus into chyme. Chyme is very pasty and disgusting looking, and it will then pass into the duodenum from the stomach, which is the upper part of the small intestine. So the stomach is composed of 4 regions. You have, as you can see, the cardia, and then swinging around the top of that, you have the fundus that you can see there. There it is. So there's the cardia here. Over here's the fundus. Going from the fundus down this way of the body. So the body would be most of the J, if you will. You swing around here, all of that is body. And then when you get up to here, you have the pyloric antrum, and then the pyloric valve is right there. That's a pyloric sphincter that closes while eating, keeping the stomach, the food inside the stomach, for the stomach to digest. Notice that the innermost muscular layer of the stomach has muscles essentially at an angle, at kind of a diagonal angle. These are the so-called oblique muscles. The contractions of the muscles are very powerful. All of you experience this. You know how I know this? Because I'm sure your stomach has growled. The growling in the stomach is due to the movement of the stomach. As it moves, it makes noise. So it's very powerful. Also, I'm sure all of you have experienced this thing called throwing up, vomiting. That's due to the very powerful contractions of your stomach. When it contracts, it doesn't feel very nice, does it? And that propels the food all the way from the stomach up to your gullet and out onto the person you really don't like. That essentially is a result of the very powerful contractions of the stomach. The stomach really propels everything right up the gullet, essentially, to the outside. Notice that the mucosa, relaxes. It relaxes. You have a center in the brainstem called the vomission center, and it's right next dorsal to it is something called the chemoreceptive zone. The chemoreceptive zone detects molecules that your body doesn't want, and it activates the vomission center. And when it activates the vomission center, it causes the sphincters to relax and the stomach to contract. And that's what causes vomiting. And when the stomach is emptying, that's what causes so-called dry heaving.
What is happening with diarrhea in the stomach?
Diarrhea is secretion in the GI tract. And so your diarrhea, your stools are very watery. Diarrhea is defined as stools with more than 200 grams of water per day.
So nothing to do with the stomach.
No. There's 4 different ways you get diarrhea. There's osmotic diarrhea, secretory diarrhea, diarrhea that is due to inappropriate contraction of the smooth muscle, or so-called inflammatory diarrhea. That's what you get with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis or something like that. Notice that the mucosa of the stomach is folded into some very interesting folds. Those are called the gastric rugae. Gastric rugae. And the gastric rugae, again, are increasing the surface area, so the food can be exposed to all the secretions of the stomach. Starting with the cardia up here. So the cardia contains cells that make a lot of protective mucus. These cells are called foveolar cells. Those are quite concentrated in the cardia. They're found throughout the stomach, but they're very concentrated in the cardia. These are going to make mucus. That mucus is going to be laced with bicarbonate. That bicarbonate is going to protect the mucosa from the stomach acid. The stomach also has a very high mitotic index. Stomach cells get replaced probably once every 4 days. Very high mitotic index. So the fundus and the body are going to contain these cells that are going to make a lot of the acid, so-called parietal cells. They make the acid. Hydrochloric acid. We'll see how they do that in just a bit. When you look at the rugae with a little more magnification, you see these little holes in the rugae. And if you section through them, you get what's called a gastric pit. And the gastric pit, as you can see, is lined with the mucosal cells. And there are different cell types in the gastric pit. Let's introduce ourselves to these particular cells. So first of all, there are goblet cells. And those goblet cells do make mucus. They don't make as much as the foveolar cells, but they do make mucus. Secondly, you have the parietal cells, and the parietal cells make hydrochloric acid. Thirdly, and the parietal cells, when you look at them, the parietal cells are big. They're bigger than the average cell on the gastric glands. The chief cells will make pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is the inactive form of pepsin. Pepsin in the presence of acid will autoactivate and it becomes an active form of pepsin. So that's made by chief cells. Fourthly, you have so-called enterochromaffin-like cells or ECL-like cells. They're going to secrete histamine. Histamine. Histamine is going to be an important signaler in the stomach. Then you have G cells. G cells. G cells secrete another peptide hormone called gastrin. Gastrin. D cells make another hormone called somatostatin. And all together, plus the acid, this whole thing makes something called gastric juice. Gastric juice. That's the liquid in your stomach. So if you upchuck, you get the chyme, but you also get gastric juice. So here's how your parietal cells make acid. So parietal cells have at their basal surface an antiporter. An antiporter we've seen before, the bicarbonate chloride antiporter. They take chloride from the cell, bicarbonate from the bloodstream. They exchange the bicarbonate for chloride. The bicarbonate then is going to combine with crumbs. Sorry. Let's start. They're going to take carbon dioxide and water, and they're going to use that California enzyme, carbonic anhydrous. I'm reading from the bottom up. They will make carbonic acid. Carbonic acid disjoins the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Well, bicarbonate is needed elsewhere. So the bicarbonate gets kicked out in exchange for chloride. You have a leak channel that will send the chloride out via facilitated fusion. Then you have the potassium proton exchanger. This is an ATP-dependent transport. It's a primary active transporter. It exchanges a hydrogen ion for potassium. Now you've kicked chloride ions and hydrogen ions into this fluid in the stomach. You've made hydrochloric acid. Drugs that are so-called proton pump inhibitors inhibit that very pump there. So drugs that end with prazole, omeprazole, S-omeprazole, lansoprazole, dexlansoprazole, pantoprazole, your mother-in-law, prazole. Those are all proton pump inhibitors, and they are used to treat gastric esophageal reflux disease. Your chief cells make pepsinogen in the presence of acid. Pepsinogen will clip the amino terminus off itself. So when the protein is born, it's born with the amino terminus essentially sitting in the active site. The acid will cause it to change conformation. So now it just clips off that amino terminus, and now the active site is free to clip proteins. So this particular peptidase is going to take proteins and convert them into smaller fragments that can be more easily digested in the duodenum. Won't degrade proteins to amino acids. It'll degrade bigger proteins into smaller peptides. Oh, that's Councilman. That's Councilman doing the, yeah, I know what he's doing.
Really, I really am going crazy.
Gastrin cells or G cells make gastrin. They'll make it in response to acetylcholine from the vagus nerve. Gastrin will then bind to the surface of ECL cells. They have a receptor for gastrin. In response, they'll make histamine. Excuse me, histamine will stimulate the parietal cells to make acid. Just like we see here. Now, the vagus nerve stimulated by several things. So Nana gets up, he goes to the kitchen, and he sees on the counter, wrapped in a plastic bag, are the bagels that somebody bought from Panera Bread. I see I'm making some of you hungry. That's okay. He looks at them, and seeing the food causes him to want to eat. So that will start, the vagus nerve will be activated. It's activated by sensory function. He puts the bagel in the toaster. The toaster will cause it to make that wonderful smell of a toasted bagel. That will further activate the vagus nerve. Am I getting to you, Luke? That also now will cause not only the salivary glands to water, but also the vagus nerve will start the stomach to secrete acid in preparation for the food that's going to happen. Now, let's say all of a sudden Nana gets a phone call, and the phone call says, you have to come right away, and he leaves the house. He's no longer exposed to the smell of the bagels, the sight of the food. That can stop. He'll be disappointed. And after a while, he'll probably be pretty darn hungry, and he'll probably be kind of ticked at the person who disrupted such a wonderful breakfast. Do you get mad? Really? Where's Evan? Where's Evan? Evan says you never get mad, but and he worked with you all summer. So, and you had to put up with Evan. So you must have a pretty long fuse. Yes. Yes. Potentially, yeah, but presumably the call engaged him enough where he stopped thinking about it, presumably. Now, if he thought about it on his bike ride over to wherever he was going, then yeah, he'd still be hungry. And to which he'd say, I hope you had better have bought breakfast, or I'm gonna be even more ticked at you than I already am. So yeah, in fact, sometimes those of you who drink coffee, the brewing of the coffee in the morning, the sound even of the coffee, the smell of the coffee, which makes me want to puke, can actually cause you to have that feeling of anticipation of the coffee and the whatever else. That can do it too. Babies, for example, there's evidence that babies can actually smell their mother, and that can actually cause them to start to salivate and anticipate the meal they're going to get from mom. And they will start to salivate. In that case, if she sees mom, that will also tend to further activate it. And in fact, some mothers, when they hear the baby cry, will actually start to lactate. And that's and then if they see their baby, they'll really start to lactate. And so yeah. All right. So again, the vagus nerve is going to play a pretty central role. Notice the vagus nerve innervates ECL cells and it innervates the G cells. And the G cells will make the gastrin is secreted into the bloodstream. And it will stimulate ECL cells to make histamine. Histamine will also be secreted into the bloodstream, but it will act pretty locally. That will also further activate the parietal cell. And there are some drugs used for treating GERD that are histamine receptor blockers. Those are available, some of them over the counter: cimetidine, ranitidine, famotidine, Pepsid. Tagamet and Zantac. That's how they essentially prevent stomach acid production, is they inhibit the histamine signal. Those drugs, you can remember them because they end with T-I-D-I-N-E, Tadine. So Tadine, okay, it's stupid, but yeah, it helps some people remember it, so. Stomach has a lot of protective mechanisms to prevent that acid and all those enzymes from destroying it. First of all, you have very tight junctions between epithelial cells. You don't get leakage of acid into the bloodstream, which would be very, very corrosive. You have a layer of mucus laced with bicarbonate, so the mucus is very alkaline. That protects it from the acid. There's a very rapid rate of cell division, and the whole thing is replaced, you can see, in 3 to 4 days. And small molecules, prostaglandins, made by the cells of the mucosae stimulate gastric secretions, mucus production, and blood flow as well into the stomach as well. And that's one reason why NSAIDs can cause stomach ulcers and things like that, because they prevent the production of those prostaglandins that are protective. If you get an erosion of the gastric mucosa, that's called a peptic ulcer. You have so-called PUD, peptic ulcer disease. Are any of you Downton Abbey fans? Unlike the Philistines in my farm class, none of whom apparently have seen Downton Abbey. No, you're Philistines too. So in Downton Abbey, there is an episode where Hugh Bonneville, the Lord of Downton, he's been diagnosed with an ulcer and he's still drinking. You shouldn't drink alcohol if you have an ulcer. And then he starts puking and up comes blood. And that's an example of someone with a peptic ulcer disease who didn't manage it very well because he kept drinking alcohol. So that breach, that's called gastritis. And gastritis can actually be caused by infection with Helicobacter pylori. And that needs to be treated with antibiotics plus Pepto-Bismol and then proton pump inhibitors as well to heal the lesion. Any questions about the stomach before we move to the small intestine? No? Yes. If you don't eat, you don't make much acid. So the stomach won't tend to digest itself because you're not eating. Not eating, say you fast, that will shut down acid production. And the cell division in the stomach will tend to be diminished as well. So the stomach will tend to shrink and tend to atrophy a bit. And then when you eat, it will regain its lost glory, shall we say. Yes? Chewing gum can increase stomach production, but not excessively. There's no evidence that chewing gum increases ulcer production or anything like that. Just don't swallow it. It's not very digestible. It's made of lots of polymers that you're not able to digest. And it's not good fiber either because it sticks together. So it balls up in your intestine. It's not very good for your regularity, shall we say. Yes, hermana. Mm-hmm. They probably have achalasia. Mm-hmm. The alcohol damages the esophagus, particularly very high percentage of alcohol drinks, whiskey and Everclear and other stuff that people drink, and they should have their head examined for drinking. Those types of alcohols, if you drink them occasionally, they're not going to hurt your stomach, your esophagus, but drinking excessively, it will burn the esophagus. And after a while, the esophagus will start to get stiff because of that scar tissue, it's fibrosis. And the only way you can fix that is to stretch it. And to do that, they put you under and they anesthetize you and they put a tool down it and they stretch it. And yes, it sounds painful and you hear this crack, snap, pop as you do it and there's bleeding. And yeah, so moderate your alcohol intake. Evan's dad will tell stories about people getting knee replacements. They have to have manipulation under anesthesia. And you put the patient out and then you just take the knee and bend it. And he says, when you hear that, you just hear the snap, crack, pop, pop, snap, tear. And it says he's used to it because he's done it so many times. But he said when he first did it, it was kind of gross. But some people, and that's why after a knee replacement, you must get the patient up and walk. And even though they complain and whine and B-word and moan about how much it hurts, they have to walk. They have to start walking early, no matter how much it hurts, or it's going to fibrose over, it's going to scar over, and they'll have to have that. And so that's why those of you who want to be PTs, you must push them. As much as it hurts, you have to get that bend. You have to get that bend, or else they're going to have to do manipulation under anesthesia. And there's not a lot of evidence that manipulation under anesthesia works. There's not good evidence it works. It's just nobody knows what else to do, so people keep doing it. Okay, another off-topic discussion. All right, let's talk about the small intestine. The small intestine is broken into 3 divisions. So after the stomach, it does kind of a U-turn. So there's kind of a C shape, and that's the duodenum. So the C shape, and then it goes for a bit, and that's the duodenum. Then the next 2/5 is called the jejunum, and then the next 3/5 is the last part, the so-called ileum. The lion's share of absorption occurs in the duodenum and jejunum. So lipids and carbs and amino acids and calcium, iron absorption, blah, 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 they occur largely in the duodenum and the jejunum. The ileum will reabsorb biosalts. It will handle vitamin B12, some of the other B vitamins as well. Water and electrolytes also are primarily absorbed in the ileum. If you get gastric bypass surgery, it's these parts that get bypassed, so that decreases the amount of calories you're able to take in. You have these plica circularis, as you can see, in the intestine. They're quite apparent as you open it up. And if you open the square up, you can see there are your villi, and then the villi in the plicae, as you see, are further elaborated essentially into these types of structures here, which are the individual villi. And then if you look at these cells that are absorptive on their apical surfaces, their membranes are folded into so-called microvilli. So you have every effort to increase the surface area. So here's your crypt down here with the cell division. And here are your cells, goblet cells. You have the blood vessels with the lacteal here like this. These cells get sloughed off into the universe there like that. And that's essentially what one of these little finger-like villar projections looks like. So the cells there that are not colored, those are your cells, the crypt cells that are dividing very rapidly. And then as the cells go up, the villus, they differentiate. Most of the cells will become just enterocytes. Every, I think it's 6th cell becomes a goblet cell. And then every 4th cell becomes a Paneth cell. Paneth cell, P-A-N-E-T-H, Paneth cell. Paneth cells secrete antimicrobial peptides that make sure that the microbes in your GI tract are kept at bay. And that's why if you have a tumor, if you have some sort of growth, it's usually from the crypt. And that's what the GI doctor is going to look for in the crypt. This is the time to stop. We will resume a week from today. And we will have our exam a week from today. So I want to wish all of you a very blessed Easter. If you drive, please drive safely. And he is risen.
Yes.